to Secretary of State. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. It's a real honour to give the inaugural Sir Henry Leach lecture. When you think of this man, a man whose name who should be remembered with all the great admirals that have come from this country, because he played such a pivotal and important role in defining the modern Britain that we see today. There was no greater post-war advocate for the value of sea power. No one who better understood the role that the Royal Navy has played and will play in the future, keeping watch over our nation and protecting our liberty. No one with greater insight into why the White Ensign is admired throughout the world, and why the reputation of our brave sailors, submariners and Royal Marines remains second to none. This year, we've once again been reminded of how our Royal Navy forged our nation, as we commemorate 100 years since the end of the Great War and the Great Sea Blockade that eventually tipped the balance decisively in our favour and our allies' favour. We remember too the astonishing bravery demonstrated at Zeebrugge, which saw an incredible 8 VCs awarded. And this year, we commemorate 75 years on from the Battle of the North Cape, in which a young Sir Henry, on board HMS Duke of York, played his part, sinking an enemy battleship to keep our Arctic convoys running, keeping Britain supplied, and the hope of our nation and our allies afloat. I'm told those who remember Sir Henry recall a courteous man who didn't suffer fools gladly, a man prepared not just to engage with Secretaries of State, but someone who was even willing to do a bolder thing, take his life into his old hands by supporting a ban on the daily rum ration. Brave move. Yet when we recall Sir Henry's sober sense in the Falklands War and in those critical hours and those critical days, a man who fortified the Iron Lady's resolve and laying the basis for a famous victory, we know that he got the big cause right. And just think how people would perceive this country if he hadn't have been so influential at that moment, if he hadn't have been the one to step up, the one that was willing to speak up, the one that was willing to commit himself and take that risk. That risk, that is the sign of leadership. That was a sign of willing to do that bit extra. That is what distinguishes someone who is willing to commit himself and do the right thing. That is leadership that I think we all so admire. And I imagine he would take great pride in seeing the way that his beloved service continues to play a global role and make a difference. The Royal Navy, the Royal Marines, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, saving lives in the Mediterranean, clearing mines and ordnance from waters around the world, helping search for fellow sailors in the stricken Argentine submarine. It goes to show the bonds that reach across different navies, old adversaries that actually have to come together because there is something more important that can sometimes be done by coming together. But we see a Royal Navy that is training navies around the world, 50 navies in total, many of whom I'm delighted to see represented here today. And while our supreme sailors guard our shores, our silent service, out of sight but never out of mind, keeps a constant watch, maintaining our continuous at-sea nuclear deterrence, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, as they have done for almost half a century. They are one of the reasons why we remain a great maritime nation. But as the conference title underlines, I'm here today to discuss the future of naval warfare. Back in 2015, the MOD published a document. Now, one thing I've quickly discovered since becoming Secretary of State is that the armed forces, and the Navy is no exception, rather like to come up with titles for documents that are not that catchy. If there's an acronym that can be found, that's where they will always go. And in a great British Royal Naval tradition, they produced a document called Strategic Trends, Programme Future Operating Environment 2035. This, having been to my local library and having asked them as to how many times they'd had a request to read that document, it has been somewhat low. But while the title was not memorable, the observations inside were accurate. It envisaged a future in which extremists exploit information technologies and where the lines between criminals, state-based actors and terrorists become increasingly blurred. It imagined a world in which the spread of dangerous devices allowed a diverse range of actors to access capabilities once restricted to a few nation states, and where others adapted and integrated technology at an incredibly fast rate. It is amazing to think about the technologies that are now available for so little money, and the way it's starting to change the way that warfare is conducted. And that is not just at sea, but also in land and air. And if we do not change, and if we do not adapt, we will be the losers. But there is one thing that we overlooked in this brilliant document. We got wrong the speed of change. We thought that the events that we had outlined would take more time to develop, 10 or 15 years. The reality is they're happening today. They're happening now. So we're rapidly having to come to terms with this new age of warfare. Look at Russia's resurgence under President Putin. Its submarine activity has increased tenfold in the North Atlantic. But that's not all. In 2010, the Royal Navy had to respond once to a Russian Navy vessel approaching UK territorial waters. Last year, we had to respond 33 times. It goes to show the increasing aggression, the increasing assertiveness of Russia, and how we have to ensure we give the right support to our Royal Navy in order to give them the tools to do the job and keep Britain safe. I doubt Sir Henry would be surprised at Russia's resurgence, nor would he bat an eyelid at our stubborn reliance on the seas for 95% of our trade, for our energy supplies, and even for our intercontinental digital communications. But I can imagine what might give him greater cause for concern is the way the threats against us are multiplying, coming not just from Russia, not just from a rising China, but from non-state actors using drones to drop bombs, ballistic missiles to attack airports, and anti-ship missiles to threaten our narrow shipping lanes, as well as the new evolving threats from cyber attacks, and of course, increasingly dealing with extreme weather conditions and the expectations that people put on our services to help and support nations right around the world. And I imagine Sir Henry would also be concerned about the pooling of dangers. So many of these dangers emerging at once. As our national security and capability strategy says, domestic, overseas and online threats are increasingly integrated as adversaries develop capabilities and exploit vulnerabilities across borders and between cyber and physical worlds. With our international rules-based order increasingly under threat, when even US Defence Secretary Mattis is prompted to remark that the US's competitive advantage has eroded in every domain of warfare, we have to sit up, and we have no option but to take action and make sure that Britain and our allies are properly defended. This is where you come in. In dangerous times, we look to the Royal Navy to lead from the front. You have that unique ability to exert not just soft power across the globe, but to back it up with tangible hard power across sea, air, land, space and cyberspace. You give us politicians a vital choice to deter, to reassure, and if necessary to act, whether independently or in concert with our allies, and that sends a powerful signal. As Sir Henry once observed, war seldom takes the expected form, and a strong maritime capability provides flexibility for the unseen. But the great question we face today is how can we adapt our Navy to meet the challenges of tomorrow? Fortunately, the great man, always prepared, left us a template, and we're following it closely. But when I just think about one key point, it is about choices. And that is what Sir Henry Leach gave Mrs. Thatcher. He gave her a choice. He gave her the opportunity to think about what she wanted to achieve and the means to do it. And that's what we need as politicians. We need our services to be able to give us the choices so we can make the right decisions. We need our services to have the capability in order to offer those choices up. But when you look at what Sir Henry did, the template that he set out, one of the key areas that was close to his heart was having the right and most modern of capabilities. In a speech to RUSI, not long after the victory in the Falklands, he said, "Periodic weapon system updating is fundamental to effective countering of a threat and the provision of it. Our investment today holds true to that principle. It's why we're building the next generation nuclear dreadnought submarines, putting almost $1 billion into our programme to begin phase 2 of production. It's why we're constructing astute hunter-killer submarines, most recently naming our newest boat after the historic Battle of Agincourt, following in the long tradition of Royal Navy ships with that iconic name." I must confess a slightly awkward and difficult meeting with the French Defence Minister shortly after the announcement, but I'm sure she understood. But it's why we're making sure we have that strategic nuclear deterrent. But it's also important to have the strategic conventional deterrent. One of the failures I think that we've had sometimes in both the political world and also the military world, we've got into a narrative about talking about deterrence purely through the spectrum of a nuclear deterrence. You do not want to be in a position where your only deterrence against threat and against aggressors is a nuclear deterrence. We've got to talk about deterrence as being a full spectrum, right across the board. It's sometimes difficult to explain to people that actually investing in our armed forces is all about making sure that things do not happen. We've got to start explaining so much more clearly that a deterrence isn't just for nuclear bombers. It is about aircraft carriers. It's about a presence in the Pacific, it's a presence in the North Atlantic, it's a presence in the Mediterranean and in the Gulf, with conventional frigates and destroyers that are able to say that Britain is interested, Britain cares, Britain will protect our interests and our values. If we do not have that conventional deterrence and the ability to deter through conventional forces, then what we'll find ourselves in is a place that none of us wish to be in, and having to turn to the greatest deterrence of them all. Leach, Sir Henry Leach, of course, was a great champion of carrier strike, and one can only imagine what he would make of a new Queen Elizabeth class, more powerful than any conventional ship ever built on our shores, displacing more than Invincible, Illustrious and Ark Royal combined, and packing a powerful punch with world-class F-35 stealth fighters. Next month, the first of those fast jets will fly across the Atlantic and land on our shores, the first to come to Europe. Later in the year, they'll be flying off the deck of HMS Queen Elizabeth, announcing that our carrier strike force is back. Meanwhile, our majestic carrier herself will be conducting her maiden voyage off the east coast of America, not just a magnificent symbol of our sea power, but of our expanding influence as a global trading nation. And our carriers will be backed up by a formidable future fleet, including next-generation global combat ships like Type 26. And we've now spent £1 billion with our suppliers to speed up those next-generation ships into service, as well as our Type 23 frigates, armed with state-of-the-art, precision-guided supersonic Sea Scepter missiles, which I can announce have successfully completed their trials and have now been accepted into service. Meanwhile, later today, my colleague Gitto Bebb will be at RNAS Yeovilton, announcing the delivery of a first of a fleet of new helicopters designed for Royal Marine aircraft carrier operations, making sure that our new carriers have the capabilities to project force, to project power, and make sure they can deliver everything that our nation asks of them. The Royal Navy's enhanced ability to manoeuvre in the literal, developing an innovative future commando force, and coupled with the restoration of our carrier strike as well as our nuclear deterrent, makes the UK one of a handful of nations that has earned the right to be a Tier 1 Navy. But the battle to remain relevant must be waged constantly. In the past 100 years, we've seen repeated revolutions in naval technology, battleships giving away to dreadnought, steam to the gas turbines, guns to guided missiles. Today, we're embracing fifth-generation technology and systems, coupled with the right mix of high-end and utility platforms in order to be able to show a presence right across the globe. But we need to be able to anticipate the next giant leap. So our modernising defence programme will make sure we continue conquering the new technological frontiers. It will build on the work of our Innovation Fund, which is investing in everything from artificial intelligence and cyber to drones. It will build on exercises like Information Warrior, which last year tested out a new ship's brain to make our Navy faster and more efficient. It will build on investments in high-energy weapons like Dragonfire. But there's a bigger challenge still, not just for defence, but for industry as a whole. It takes 15 to 20 years plus to procure an aircraft carrier. How many models of iPhone will have been procured and developed in that time? Technology is moving so fast. No one can truly guarantee what the future holds. And if we do not have technology and be able to use technology and bring technology into our ships, into our submarines, at a much faster pace, then we will always be behind our enemies. We've got to be able to change and learn how to do that. So we're seeking to create new partnerships with industry, academia and the public sector to bypass the old ways of doing things, making better use of current technology, maximising our flexibility and tapping into the talents of our wider workforce. The best brains and the best technology in some of the fields that we will be so dependent on in the future will not always sit within the defence sector. And we must not be too proud to borrow and to use that technology in order to make us better. If you look at the car industry, they will always be able to invest so much more in autonomous technology because they will quite simply be producing so much more than we ever will do in the military field. Let us look to new partners, seize the advantage, take advantage of the technologies that they are developing, so many of them here in Britain where we lead the world, and use them to our advantage. So our service men and women have that cutting edge, have the advantage over our adversaries so that we can build them. And as we develop our shipbuilding strategy, alongside our competition to build Type 31E frigates, we'll increase our competitiveness with our industrial partners by shifting and focusing more on exports to help us reduce prices, to build more ships, because let us not forget that mass has a quality all of its own and something that every navy, every army and every air force truly does need. But we have to always be thinking about the prosperity of our nation. We cannot have prosperity without security that we deliver to our nation. But we also need to be looking at how we strengthen relationships with our allies, encouraging that partnership, encouraging that closer working relationship so we can bring ever greater prosperity to our nation. But when we do look at partnerships, and when we look at military partnerships, it was another anchor of what Sir Henry saw as so pivotal to our nation. As in his day, NATO remains the beating heart of our defence and our security. Sir Henry knew that only the world's greatest defensive alliance stood in the way of Soviet aggression. In a very different world, NATO couldn't be more relevant. That's why, as we leave the European Union, we're redoubling our efforts, with our Navy leading half of NATO's task forces in the Mediterranean. Yet like Sir Henry, we know we must also look beyond NATO's northern and southern flanks to its worldwide economic flanks. So we're extending our partnership principle. In the past month, the Royal Navy has been exercising with a 9-nation Joint Expeditionary Force for the first time. They've been operating together in the Gulf. We have our new naval support facility in Bahrain at Jaffa, and our commitment to the port of Duqm in Oman. All of this signals that we're investing heavily in the Middle East at a time of unprecedented uncertainty. And I can today announce that we will be extending that commitment by sending Type 23s to the Gulf from 2019 as an enduring presence. Over in the Asia Pacific, for the first time in recent memory, we'll have 3 Royal Navy vessels in the region supporting our allies. And we continue to strengthen our bilateral relationships with Royal Navy helicopters deployed as part of the French Jeanne d'Arc task group, our submarines working with the US, such as HMS Trenchant, working in the High North, and our Royal Marines recently training with the US Marine Corps in Guam. We're weaving a web of partnerships, demonstrating our global reach and world-class capability. Yet facing the future also demands one more element, a key weapon in the great Admiral's armoury: confidence. When Prime Minister Thatcher sought Sir Henry's advice on the Falklands, he spoke powerfully for intervention. He said, if we do not, or if we pussyfoot in our actions, or do not achieve complete success, in another few months, we shall be living in a different country whose word counts for little. How true. If he hadn't have been there, if he hadn't have been there to give her that option, to give her that decision to make, our nation's history would have been so different. At a time when we're facing a generational change in the threats to our interests, when our great values of liberty, justice and tolerance are under attack from every angle, we must always have that confidence to speak out, to stand up, to act when challenged. That's why, as we leave the European Union, you will not find the UK retreating to its shores, exchanging isolation for foreign policy. Instead, you will find us seeking to expand our friendships, expand our influence, extend our trading lines, and out of a shadow of present danger, shine the beacon of democracy that so many nations have always looked to Britain for. I can't predict the future of naval warfare. That's why I have the Royal Navy to do that for us. But let me offer a vision for the Royal Navy. It's a vision of a Navy that maintains its position as a premier maritime force, a Royal Navy balancing both strategic and operational responsibilities, innovative by instinct, always one step ahead of our adversaries, and ever the partner of choice for its allies. It is a vision of a Royal Navy always forward deployed and truly global. It's a Royal Navy that will be in the finest traditions, continue to rule the waves, seizing every new opportunity and carrying our nation's great expectations far into the future. In other words, it's a vision of a Royal Navy that will continue doing for our country and for Sir Henry Leach, Mrs. Thatcher's knight in shining gold braid. It will continue to do all of us and them proud. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Secretary of State, thank you so much for that masterful and indeed an inspiring lecture. It got us off to a great start for our deliberations today, and it was a marvellous inaugural Sir Henry Leach lecture. So thank you so much indeed for that. If I could request you all to remain seated while we change the name cards on the platform, and can I invite our speakers and chair for the...
As a young researcher. So we have I think about just under an hour and 15 minutes, we have a very interesting panel looking at the future of warfare, from a maritime perspective, but also, in a way, we're setting up the conversation after that very brilliant speech. We're going to be looking at technological changes, geopolitical changes, strategic and tactical changes. We have an age in which between now and 2030, shipping is supposed to grow by 50%. We have a middle class, global middle class, which will grow by 50% by 2030. Much of this will be happening in the Indo-Pacific, which sets the UK up very well from Duckham. But we're not going it alone to the region. Asia is becoming the center of the global economy. By 2050, it's said to account for maybe 52% of global GDP, and it's going by sea. BRI is very sexy, but BRI is still going to be more expensive than ships, both in containers and also in commercial shipping. And of course, we see the rise of Mahanian precepts in the Indian Navy and the Chinese Navy. And we see the groupings like the quadrilaterals and the trilaterals now beginning to divide and diversify the region in all these different axes. Up with me on the panel, we have an extremely, I think, incredibly intelligent, and I'm awestruck by them. I'll start, forgive me, I'll start perhaps going from this side, Professor Patrick Porter, who's now at the University of Birmingham. I've long followed his work on almost every topic. Professor Porter is one of those individuals who, if you don't know his work, you need to look at it. He recently published an extremely good piece in International Security on U.S. grand strategy. I found it very, very impressive and continue to see him as someone who is probably one of the great strategic thinkers in this city. Coming next to me is Martin Murphy, who is at King's College at the Corbett Center for Maritime Studies. Like myself, UK and US dual citizen, the special relationship side by side here. Someone who's written more than 60 books and monographs on maritime things. And someone I think today who'll be looking at hybrid warfare. So I think to some extent we have technological changes, we have hybrid warfare, so we're going to have like some interchanging between that. And then we will also, from my right, Jochen Bittner, who I have not known before, who is an extremely good journalist at Die Welt, but he's also a philosopher, and you can absolutely tell he's a philosopher if you read his recent works in the New York Times on what is happening to the geopolitical order. He's going to talk today about China, Russia, and the West, and how that... So I think in some ways he's kind of setting up the big picture. I'm not sure if there's a preferred order, but I almost think that if we start, kind of 80,000 feet up, we might well start with some of the philosophical and geopolitical aspects of this, and then move steadily to my left, if that's acceptable to the panel. So, Jochen, that kind of puts the pressure on you. I hand it over to you, and please take it away. You have about 12 minutes each, gentlemen.
That's great. John, thanks very much. Thanks, RUSI, for inviting me over. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I have to admit, to a German in particular, it's always a cultural shock, always and always again, to see British debates on security. When I saw the speech, heard the speech by the Secretary of State, I first wondered what weapon systems could the German Secretary of Defense praise? And would she, even if we have those weapons in Germany, would she allow herself to give a speech like that? Because people like myself would immediately accuse her of ballicism and militarism. So this is another topic, of course, but it just sprang to my mind when I heard this brilliant lecture. What I wanted to do today is try to give you an impression of how I feel what we are going through at the moment in a geopolitical sense, because I believe that the idea of a new Cold War doesn't really match what we are seeing today. My impression is that what we are witnessing on the global stage more resembles a new great game. And this was what I wanted to put to you. Why am I talking about a new great game? I think we are seeing a new collision of great powers, quite similar to the collision that we saw in the 19th century. It's about competition for spheres of influence, trying to roll back spheres of influence. But unlike the great game of the 19th century between the British and the Russian Empire, today's new great game is even more global, more complex, and I believe potentially more dangerous. Let me call the new great game the game of threes. The game of threes involves three prime players, Russia, China, and the West, and they are competing in three ways: geographically, intellectually, and economically. Also, there are three places where the different claims to power clash, or clash most: Syria, Ukraine, and the Pacific. So the game of threes has a threefold, three-dimension to it. Coming to the, or starting off with the intellectual dimension of the game of threes. What we are witnessing in the West today is a growing doubt whether the post-war internationalism has been or will be the right way forward, and if the form of European integration and multilateralism is actually the most effective way of international governing. Now, to all those who doubt and dither about the right way forward, China and Russia stand ready as alternative models and protective powers, offering new arrangements for bilateral and multilateral alignments. In other words, if you don't want to follow international law, European integration, a painstaking acquis communautaire, or anti-corruption schemes, why not just follow China and Russia? Take Egypt, for example. What will prove more attractive to the Egyptian government in the likely case of another mass uprising in the country? An alignment with Europe, which is annoyingly nervous about the respect for human rights, or an alignment with Russia, which has proven that it will look the other way in the face of domestic oppression, even if an ally uses chemical weapons against its own people. And what could this then potentially mean for, let's say, the Suez Canal fees? Now, while Russia offers military ruthlessness, China offers the mercantile variant, economic ruthlessness. Unlike the West, China doesn't let human rights and the rule of law get in the way of investments. Take Ukraine, for example. In late 2017, Beijing increased its investment in Ukraine, announcing it as an important building block in its new Silk Road to Europe. Now, the government in corruption-ridden Kiev has already gladly declared 2019 the year of China in Ukraine. Or take the Balkans. You could, as a prime minister of a Balkan state, wait endlessly, of course, for the European Union to let you enter the club by adhering to strict compliance standards and implementation of 800,000 pages of required laws. Or you could turn to Chinese investors, which many of those states increasingly do, who won't ask for any such fuss. Interestingly, and